So what happens when a protest gets labeled as something else entirely? Today, we're going to dive into a report from Blaze TV that makes a pretty provocative claim about recent events in Minnesota. We're going to break down the argument and the evidence they use piece by piece. Okay, so this is it. This is the central claim from the source material we're examining, and wow, it is a powerful one. This single sentence completely reframes the narrative, right? It suggests that what we're seeing isn't just some spontaneous protest, but something far more deliberate and, well, ideologically driven. So, what exactly is this organizing engine? Well, the report we're analyzing claims there's a specific group driving all this activity from behind the scenes. Let's take a look at who they say it is. All right, so the source material really hones in on this idea of an organizing engine. And right at the heart of it, they name a group called MIRAC. So the main player they identify is the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee, or MIRAC for short. The report's whole argument is that even if MIRAC isn't a household name, it's deeply, deeply integrated into the anti-ICE network, giving it a ton of influence behind the scenes. And this is where the source really starts to connect the dots. It points to things like raid response trainings. Now, on the surface, that might just sound like, community defense, but the report argues these activities are actually the on-ramps, the entry points for a much, much bigger ideological goal. And that brings us right to the core ideology the source says is driving all this, what they describe as a combination of abolition and the concept of Turtle Island. So, according to the report, we're not just talking about policy tweaks here. These are supposedly the explicit, non-negotiable end goals. The argument being made is that this isn't about fixing the system, it's about completely dismantling it. A revolutionary ideology, not just a push for some reforms. The source has a very specific name for this movement, the Turtle Island Intifada. Now, to really get what they mean by that, we've got to define that first part, Turtle Island. The report claims that using this term is a really big deal. Why? Because it completely reframes the continent. It's not the United States or Canada anymore. It's an occupied territory that needs to be liberated. And by doing that, you're essentially denying the fundamental legitimacy of the countries that exist there. And check this out. The source highlights this direct quote from MIRAC's social media to connect what's happening at home with conflicts overseas. It's presented as proof that the group sees North America through the very same lens of occupation as it does Palestine. Okay, so sticking with that international connection, the source then zooms out to look at what it calls a whole web of global alliances. The report lays out these different alliances as proof of a consistent, broad anti-US ideology. The argument here is that these aren't just one-off political stances. No, they're presented as pieces of a coherent worldview that consistently aligns with foreign adversaries of the United States. And to really underscore their point about the pro-Iran stance, the source brings up this number, 35,000. That's the alleged number of people recently executed by the Iranian government. The report uses this figure to try and put into context the kind of regime they claim MIRAC was praising. So how does this ideology supposedly translate into action? Well, the source lays out what it calls the insurgency framework, and it's all about how language is used to completely reshape perception. The report is basically saying, look, this is not just about words. It's a deliberate strategy. By changing the vocabulary, you change the entire moral equation. What most people would call law enforcement, they allegedly call an occupying force. And what might look like obstruction suddenly gets reframed as heroic resistance. And the report offers up this statement, which it attributes to MIRAC as Exhibit A for that whole framework. The argument is that this quote creates a kind of moral permission slip for their tactics by cleanly separating their own actions, calling them resistance, from the state's actions, which are labeled violence. The report actually calls this a process of ideological conditioning. It's kind of like that old story of the frog in boiling water. The argument is that people are brought in with these really reasonable-sounding ideas, like community defense. But from there, step by step, their perceptions are tweaked until actions that once seemed extreme are suddenly reframed as not just necessary, but as heroic acts of liberation. And this brings us to the final piece of the argument, which the source calls the protester's dilemma. And it's all about the role of the everyday person you might see in the crowd. Here's the argument. You have well-meaning people show up to a protest, folks who don't believe in this radical ideology at all. But, according to the source, they end up being used as basically human camouflage. Their peaceful presence provides cover and a veneer of legitimacy for a much more radical core that has a totally different agenda. And this is the really crucial part of their argument. The danger isn't that every single person in the crowd is a radical. It's actually the opposite. The organizers, the report claims, don't need ideological purity. They just need a crowd. So every person there chanting for compassion might be unwittingly providing a shield for an ideology that the source claims praises Iran and seeks to abolish the country. And at the end of the day, this is the core takeaway from the source material. The argument is that a line is being crossed here, that this isn't part of a civil debate over reform, but an organized action that flat out rejects the legitimacy of the system itself. So ultimately, what this report leaves us with is a really critical question. Where do you draw the line between passionate activism and an ideology that seeks abolition? It challenges you, the viewer, to look past the banners and consider the deeper goals of any organized movement.